Bom dia a todos. Está começando o último dia do segundo Encontro Nacional sobre o Estado Administrativo, Direitos, Fundamentais, Instituições e Mercado, organizado pelo Laboratório de Estudos Teóricos e Analíticos sobre o Comportamento das Instituições, LETASSE, o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Direito da UFRJ e o professor Eduardo Moreira, com patrocínio do CNPq, CAPES e FAPERJ. Agradecemos a presença de todas as autoridades, professores convidados e os professores da casa, Centro Acadêmico Cândido de Oliveira e a todos os alunos da Faculdade Nacional de Direito e de outras universidades. Gostaríamos de convidar para a primeira palestra do dia, Mark Tushnet, professor de Direito da Harvard Law School, que ministrará a palestra Institutions Protecting Democracy, a Preliminary Analysis. Good morning. We'd like to open the second day of the second national meeting of the Administrative State, Fundamental Rights, Institutions and Market, organized by the UFRJ's Postgraduate Program in Law, LETASSE and Professor Eduardo Moreira, with the support of CNPq, CAPES and FAPERJ. We'd like to thank all the authorities, the invited professors, and the professors from the institution, Centro Acadêmico Cândido de Oliveira, and all the students from this and other universities. Now we'd like to invite Mark Tushnet, professor from Harvard Law School, to present the lecture, Institutions Protecting Democracy, a Preliminary Analysis.
I think I have to stand up. Thank you very much for the invitation to. Is this enough, or should I hold it? Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation to present this talk. I've been in attendance at this university before and enjoyed my presentation then and learned from the conversations. I just want to note that after I conclude my talk, I do want to open it up for questions and discussion so I can find out what your reaction is to the kinds of ideas I am talking about. As the introduction indicated, I am engaged in the early stages of a project of examining what I call institutions protecting democracy. And today I'm going to focus on anti-corruption agencies, although I will begin by indicating the broader scope of the inquiry. I know that some of these issues are of immediate relevance in Brazil, although I don't have particular examples from Brazil in my talk, but I'm happy again to respond to comments based on the experience that's happening in Brazil with anti-corruption investigations. I want to begin with a sort of general framing of the problem or of the question. Historically, we know that there have been what I think of as three traditional branches of government. The legislature that makes rules, the executive that enforces them, and the judiciary that interprets or determines conflicts over the meaning of rules. And then early in the 20th century, the Austrian legal theorist Hans Kelsen identified a fourth general function that institutions could play, and that is the function of protecting the Constitution. And historically, each of these functions was located in particular institutions. So again, legislature made laws and judges interpreted them, and for Kelsen, the Constitutional Court protected the Constitution. One thing that we learned over the course of the 20th century is that these functions don't have to be allocated to individual institutions. They can be divided among them. So in the United States, we came to understand that administrative agencies, as we call them, combine the function of lawmaking and law application and law interpretation. So the classical functions were fractured, divided up among institutions. And by the end of the 20th century, we meaning people thinking about the Constitution and constitutional design, came to understand that the function of protecting the Constitution, and in particular protecting the democratic constitutions, could be divided up among many institutions as well. It did not have to be done solely by the Constitutional Court. I should note that in some places, the Constitutional Court continues to do many of the functions that I'll identify specifically in a moment. The justification for doing so, I think, primarily is limitations on resources. So in nations with relatively small, legally trained elites, you may not have enough personnel to staff the fairly large number of potential institutions to protect democracy. But if you do have enough lawyers and others to staff these institutions, institutional designers tend to try to separate them out into separate institutions. The South African Constitution describes these as institutions supporting constitutional democracy. And in South Africa, the list includes, in what's called Chapter 9, the public protector, the state auditor, and the election commission. And my investigation is into these various kinds of institutions protecting democracy. In the paper that I've developed, I talk about electoral commissions, central banks, and constitutional courts, as well as anti-corruption agencies, but I'm going to focus here on anti-corruption agencies. There's one preliminary point before I turn to that specifically, and that is there are many arrangements that can be called institutions protecting democracy. One account of the overall system of separation of powers is that it protects democracy by preventing the accumulation of too much power in any one person's hands. And maybe more significantly, a vibrant civil society can be said to be indeed to be essential to democracy. But to avoid sweeping everything in society into the category of institutions protecting democracy, I'm going to treat them as institutions whose specific charge is to protect one or another dimension of democratic functioning. Now, to motivate and provide some insight into some of the dimensions of the design problems that I'm mostly interested in, I'm going to begin with a short account of a celebrated example of conflict over these institutions in South Africa. Chapter 9 of the South African Constitution, to which I referred before, actually doesn't in terms include an anti-corruption agency as one of the institutions supporting democracy, but there was an intense and highly political controversy over corruption investigations that led the court there, told that the Constitution's requirement that government be open, responsible, and accountable placed a duty on the Parliament to create an independent anti-corruption agency. So here's a short summary of the story. There are in South Africa two institutions that might investigate corruption. One is the National Prosecuting Authority, and the name signifies what its primary function is. It is a prosecuting agency, not an investigating one. And then there's the South African Police Services, which are police services that do investigations. The Constitution requires the appointment of a single national prosecuting authority headed by an independent director of public prosecutions. In 1999, Parliament created a special investigative unit within the National Prosecuting Authority to deal with what they called national priority crime, which included corruption, organized crime, and financial crimes. This unit was called the Directorate of Special Operations, and it came to be called the Scorpions because they had a scorpion on the logo of their, the letterhead of their material, and I will refer to them as the Scorpions. The head of the National Prosecuting Authority reports to the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, but the minister had no authority to control the National Prosecuting Agency's prosecutorial actions. That prosecutor had a substantial degree of independence of political control. The South African Police Services is an ordinary police force. It reports to the Minister of Justice and Constitutional Development, and the minister does exercise direct supervision over the police service. When the Scorpions controversy arose, the police service did have legal authority to investigate corruption and other crimes that also fell within the Scorpions' jurisdiction. Now, by all accounts, the Scorpions were quite effective in pursuing organized crime and corruption. They did face some professional jealousy from the police service of a sort of typical bureaucratic sort. There was a commission of inquiry appointed in 2005 after about 6 years of the operation of the Scorpions. And the commission concluded that relations between the two organizations had irretrievably broken down, but the inquiry recommended continuing the Scorpions' operation, and basically nothing was done to change the arrangements. Now, the Scorpions' anti-corruption investigations, Scorpions investigated a lot of things, including drug crime, organized crime in general, but they also investigated corruption. And their anti-corruption activities became bound up with factional politics within the nation's dominant party, the African National Congress. The two main factions were associated with the President, Thabo Mbeki, and Deputy President Jacob Zuma. And the party managed the factional conflict by ensuring that some of Zuma's associates held official positions, which meant that they had opportunities to engage in corruption. Now, one scandal attracted a great deal of public attention. It was called the arms deal, in which officials pursued an important economic development opportunity for South Africa, the arms industry, notably an industry that's notorious around the world for corruption. And so the officials promoted this economic activity and simultaneously solicited bribes. Now, this is an important feature of some significant corrupt activities, and that is they often combine some degree of personal enrichment on the part of the public official with some action that has, in some significant sense, important public benefits. So in the arms deal scandal, there appears to have been some degree of private enrichment, but also it was aimed at this important economic development activity. Other kinds of public benefits that I'll mention later is, again, private enrichment coupled with some action aimed at strengthening the official's political party by, for example, soliciting contributions that will be used to support the party's activities. Now, some of the contribution does privately enrich the official, but much of it is aimed at these party-building activities. After the Scorpions obtained the conviction of a businessman who had served as Zuma's financial advisor, they began to investigate Zuma himself. And the important feature here to note is that they investigated Zuma. There's very little doubt that there was also corruption associated with Mbeki and his faction, but the Scorpions did not do much investigation over Mbeki's faction. So Zuma's faction believed that the Scorpions were selectively targeting them, and the factional combat culminated in a conference of the party in 2007. Zuma's faction prevailed. It stripped Mbeki of his role in the party, which led to his resignation and his replacement as president, eventually by Zuma. There's a short interval where somebody else becomes president. Resolutions adopted by the party at that same meeting, again, where Zuma prevailed over Mbeki, called for dissolving the Scorpions and transferring their duties to the police service. And that's what happened. There's a new statute that created a directive for priority crime investigations, came to be known as the Hawks, within the police service. I won't go through the details of how it was organized. The dissolution of the Scorpions and the replacement by the Hawks was immediately challenged as unconstitutional by a businessman and an NGO. And the Constitutional Court ruled 5-4 that dissolving the Scorpions was unconstitutional. And it's worth noting that serious constitutional judges, not partisan hacks, were on both sides of this. So the lead opinion was written by, co-written by Justice Edwin Cameron, very well-respected judge, and the dissent was written by Chief Justice Sandile Nkobo, also a quite well-respected judge. All of them actually agreed that the Constitution required the creation of an independent anti-corruption agency on the ground that corruption was a threat to democracy. Corruption threatens to fell at the knees virtually everything we hold dear and precious in our hard-won constitutional order. So having concluded that the Parliament had to create an anti-corruption agency with adequate independence, the court had to decide whether the Hawks, the replacement for the Scorpions, were sufficiently independent. And without going through, again, the details of the analysis, the court found that the majority found that they were not sufficiently independent. There was too much the possibility of control by ministers over the hawks was too great to be tolerated. The majority's gravest disquiet, they said, came from the supervision by a cabinet committee, which puts significant power in the hands of senior political executives. And they might be the subjects of anti-corruption investigations. The statute made provision for hands-on supervision, management, and interference. Now, the dissent actually was disagreed. I misspoke earlier. The dissent disagreed that the Constitution required the creation of an independent anti-corruption agency, but also addressed the question of the hawks' independence and concluded that they were sufficiently independent. Okay, so the court finds the dissolution of the scorpions unconstitutional, or the replacement of the scorpions by the hawks unconstitutional, and it gave the government 18 months to redesign the hawks. It said they didn't have to recreate the scorpions, but they had to improve the independence of the hawks. The government did respond by essentially tinkering with the organization chart. They actually didn't do anything substantial, and the businessmen and the NGO challenged the new legislation, and the Constitutional Court once again held the new legislation unconstitutional for failing to provide sufficient independence. I again won't go through the details of what the court said. I do note that the opinion in the first case by Justice Cameron and the dissent by Justice Nkobo, those were both quite serious and on the whole, legally adequate opinions. The opinion in the second case was, in my judgment, relatively thin and not terribly well defended. It was, I should say, it was written by the new Chief Justice, someone whose name is Mogang, who is not a well-regarded jurist in South Africa. So the Hawks have continued to investigate corruption. They have continued to generate political controversy for pursuing a political agenda, particularly in connection with a relatively recent investigation of, again, a very well-regarded minister of finance, who was forced to step down and then reinstated. This is a person who had actually helped stabilize South Africa's reputation in the international financial community, and so forcing him out of office was a significant political action taken in effect by the Hawks. It didn't hold. Finally, he was reinstated, but it was quite disruptive. Okay, so now I want to talk, so that's the South African story in brief. I now want to talk about institutions protecting democracy more generally. And the Scorpions case study provides an entry point into thinking about them in more detail. So the first observation is that we almost certainly should distinguish between corruption at the highest level and corruption by low-level officials. Pretty much every regime wants to limit corruption at the lowest level because that has a serious effect on its legitimacy. Everybody encounters, if you have corrupt police officers on the streets, everybody encounters them. And it engenders real suspicion of the regime. Even authoritarian regimes or near authoritarian regimes try to control corruption at the lowest level. China, a purely authoritarian regime, goes through these periodic anti-corruption agencies to root out low-level corruption. Singapore, which is not quite an authoritarian regime, is extremely fierce about low-level corruption. And so you can rely on the incentives that high-level officials have to challenge or to you can rely on those incentives to use the ordinary methods of investigation to deal with low-level corruption. High-level corruption is maybe a different matter. And the reason is, again, democratic legitimacy does require confidence that officials are not corrupt, but it's very difficult to, or people are skeptical about the claim that high-level officials can investigate either themselves or each other. And even separation of powers kinds of investigations are a problem. What I mean by that is you could design a system in which the members of Congress had authority to investigate corruption by high-level executive officials, by ministers, and a system in which the ministers had the authority, the Minister of Justice, had the authority to investigate corruption by members of Congress. But the concern there would be, again, that there would be selective investigations, that Congress would investigate only executive officials associated with not associated with their own party. And similarly, the Minister of Justice would investigate only members of Congress who are affiliated with an opposition party. And so there's reason, based on the incentives that high-level officials have, to create an independent anti-corruption prosecutor. But there are very serious design issues associated with such agencies. The primary difficulties are associated with overzealousness and its opposite, under-enforcement. A failure to pursue serious claims that a high-level official has engaged in corruption. The Scorpion story illustrates one problem. If the independent investigator is not independent enough, then you face problems of under-enforcement. Or if the agency is not independent enough of, say, the control by the dominant party, the African National Congress, or rather by one faction within the dominant party, then the Scorpions will investigate the other faction, but not the favored faction. But, and it should be clear why that's a problem. And I think experience suggests that there's a more important problem of overzealous enforcement. And this arises if the prosecutor is too independent. So the design problem is to make the prosecutor independent enough, but not too independent. What I mean by overzealousness is this. I referred in the arms deal story to the combination of private enrichment and public benefit from corruption. There, it's private enrichment and strengthening an important domestic economic development opportunity. I also mentioned a common phenomenon, again, private enrichment coupled with strengthening party building efforts. The line between corruption and these public benefit activities, building party, encouraging economic development that will redound to the benefit of both the country and the governing party, the line between private enrichment or corruption and those things is often quite thin, or maybe more significant, the private enrichment component of the activity may be a relatively small part of what's going on. Yes, there is some private enrichment, but the real phenomenon is party building or economic development that will benefit the governing party. So now the overzealousness problem occurs when the anti-corruption investigator focuses on the private enrichment part of what's occurring and overlooks or doesn't understand what I've been calling public benefit part of the phenomenon. That can be actually the result of ignorance on the part of the investigator. That is, if you place a lawyer or a legally focused person in charge of an anti-corruption agency, that person may not be sensitive to the party building and economic development dimensions of the phenomenon, just may not know, may not understand that what's going on is primarily party building or economic development, but does understand what private enrichment is. Okay, so that's a sort of a problem of, call it, political ignorance. There's another problem with, again, overzealousness arising from too much independence, and that problem is that the head of the anti-corruption agency can build a constituency to support him or her personally, not merely in the agency's current work, but for some future activity. Now, the easiest thing to think about is an anti-corruption prosecutor who imagines running for elective office in the future. Okay? This is a phenomenon that occurs quite often in the United States. Now, that person may pursue cases not because they are central to attacking corruption, but because the publicity associated with the investigation and prosecution will create a reputation for the prosecutor as a real defender of the public interest who ought to be trusted with public office when he or she seeks it in the future. The clearest example I have here is modest, it needs some significant qualifications, but the South African ombudswoman is a person of the sort that I've just described. That is, she was a partisan, basically a party hack, when she was appointed to be ombudswoman, then discovered that she could build a serious public reputation by doing the job of an ombudswoman, and it's likely that she's going to end up as a significant minister, vice president, maybe even president sometime in the future. Even if the prosecutor is not thinking about the running for office in the future, the benefits of public, call it adulation, or public, a reputation among the public for fearless defense of the public interest can be extremely personally satisfying. And so the investigator may get a certain kind of personal psychological benefit from being an aggressive prosecutor. Let's see. So I now want to, so those are the problem with the independent anti-corruption agency is under-enforcement, selective enforcement, or overzealous enforcement. And the remedy for that is to design the institution so that there is just the right level of independence on the prosecutor. Not so much that the prosecutor will be overzealous, but not so little that the prosecutor will under-enforce or selectively enforce. Okay, I now want to step back from the anti-prosecutor agency in particular and talk a little about more general design issues. I said, but using again the anti-prosecuting agencies as the focal point. I said that we create independent agencies, these independent prosecuting agencies, because we don't think that the legislature or the executive can do a good job of investigating each other. They have incentives that skew them away from doing the job well. There's a second theme that arises from my mention of sort of, I use the word ignorance, political ignorance on the part of a legally trained prosecutor. What you want in this institution is expertise in rooting out corruption, knowing what kind of investigation to do, tempered by sensitivity to politics. Okay? And here we can now think of ways of combining this, combining expertise with sensitivity to politics. And I'll turn now to how courts, and in particular the Constitutional Court, might be thought of as a place where you have that kind of combination. Here the Constitutional Courts are independent. They are appointed in ways that ensure some degree of political sensitivity on the part of the judges. That's the part of the design of Kelson's constitutional courts. And so you might think you could use the Constitutional Court as this kind of investigating agency. A footnote here, it is the Constitutional Court that has this combination. Kelson worried that in a civil law system, ordinary judges who were hired and promoted in more bureaucratic ways would not have sufficient political sensitivity but the Constitutional Court would. Now, the problem with constitutional courts as anti-corruption agencies is that the balance between, or the kinds of expertise that they have may not be suitable for the job. They are mostly experts in law because they have to be. Their professional commitment to the rule of law does give them the intellectual resources to resist, to some significant degree, merely political pressures. But they may not they may not deploy their political sensitivity effectively. And the reason, I think, is that phenomenon that scholars have identified under the label mission commitment. What mission commitment means is that a person who is trained in one discipline, auditing, law, engineering, thinks that that disciplinary expertise dominates all other considerations. So a common observation about censorship boards is this. The job of a censorship board is to censor. And what that means is they will censor too much. The way I put it when I teach this to my students is to say, no censorship board wants to write an annual report at the end of the year that says, we didn't find anything worth censoring this year. Okay? So similarly, with an anti-corruption agency, similarly with a court, the court will say, well, we found these violations of law, private enrichment from corruption, because we're lawyers. That's what we think about. The problem is the anti-corruption agency, an independent anti-corruption agency, has the same mission commitment. It doesn't want to write an annual report saying, we found 4 instances of low-level corruption and closed 5 investigations of corruption by ministers that we didn't think were worth prosecuting. Okay, so how can you deal with these difficulties? Well, one possibility is to adjust the composition of the anti-corruption agency. In particular, let me rely on design of electoral commissions around the world. Those commissions are designed as multi-member bodies with, I'll just put it in a simplified version, multi-partisan or bipartisan composition. And the thought is that by putting all the parties into the electoral commission, you will get fairness and among the parties. Well, one possibility for an anti-corruption agency is to make it have more than one chief head. Make it a board of investigators and say, we'll have 3 members. Doesn't matter at this point how they're appointed, but the head of the anti-corruption agency is a 3-person board, and it can proceed with an investigation only if 2 or maybe even if all 3 agree that the investigation should go forward. That does weaken a certain kind of responsibility on the part of the agency. If you have a single person heading the agency, you know who to blame if they either over-investigate or fail to pursue an investigation. If you have a three-person board, it's harder to allocate responsibility, but it might be that the trade-off between responsibility and reducing overzealousness would be worth it. Now, a final set of responses, and this is, I'm moving toward a conclusion, is providing review of what the anti-corruption agency does in the constitutional court or even in the ordinary courts. Now, I should say, of course, we're not going to design these institutions to give the anti-corruption agency authority to impose sanctions. They're going to have to bring the cases to court. In that review, maybe you could recommend, I'm not sure how you could design things to make sure it would happen, but you could recommend that courts be sensitive to the risk of overzealousness. When presented with a case that involves a combination of private enrichment and public benefit, figure out some way to interpret the statute, the corruption statute, that limits the liability for the private enrichment. There's a case in the United States that does something like that. Beyond review of convictions by the courts, what other kinds of review might there be? Well, you could say that the Constitutional Court could investigate the, it could investigate either the procedures, could supervise the procedures being used by the anti-corruption agency, or the degree to which the agency is independent. The latter is what happened in the South African cases. What about reviewing the procedures? So the idea would be that the Constitutional Court could say, you are authorized to do this investigation, but you have to use only these methods. I don't know exactly what they would be, but will guard against overzealousness by making it more difficult for you to investigate. There's an interesting provision in the, let me just pause with that. We will say, when you're investigating high-level corruption, you have to follow procedures of the sort that are sensitive to the impairment of reputation that occurs and the political harm that occurs when an investigation is opened. One possibility, I'm not a specialist in this part of the design, but one possibility would be very stringent requirements on keeping the investigation secret until very serious evidence has been accumulated to support the charge. Okay. One difficulty with this is that judges may not be aware of some of the difficulties associated with investigating corruption. There's an interesting provision in the Constitution of Ecuador which makes reference to investigations of cover-ups and the use of fronts as a way of concealing corruption. And it may be that judges are not very good at figuring out how to investigate the use of cover-ups and fronts, and so they might impose too many limits on what a prosecutor would do. Okay, so that would be reviewing the procedures. A second possibility would be to review the degree of independence, and as I said, that's what happened in the South African cases. The problem there is that at least the evidence from the South African cases is not very encouraging. The analysis of independence in the first case was adequate. The analysis of independence in the second was, in my judgment, not adequate. The judges didn't have enough, weren't able to express in legal terms the concerns about independence that they had. I actually am not sure that they were wrong in either case. The reason I'm not sure is that the South African political elite is very small, and the judges of the Constitutional Court are part of it. And they may well have had a feel for what's going on that they couldn't capture in the legalistic language that was available to them. So the opinion turns out to be unsatisfactory, although the result may be fine. But that's a problem if you have, if the judges are more removed from actual having, as I put it, a feel for the problem. To the extent that we have information about Constitutional Court's behavior in cases with issues similar to those that would be presented in connection with a review of anti-corruption agencies' actions, it comes from accounts of what Ron Herschel calls cases of megapolitics, which he defines as core political controversies that define the boundaries of the collective or cut through the heart of entire nations. I'll just summarize my judgment about courts' action in these megapolitics cases. They're occasionally successful, but overall the record is disappointing. And if that's so, if my assessment is correct, then the avenues of review by constitutional courts that I have outlined for their procedures of the agencies or adequate independence, those constitutional courts may not perform those functions very well. There's one final point I want to make before I stop and invite questions. And that is to think of the Constitutional Court as either a buffer between the anti-corruption agency and the other traditional branches, or as a mechanism for coordinating all of these actions. The buffer idea comes out of the Scorpions case. There the Constitutional Court intervened not to ensure or certify that the anti-corruption agencies were keeping their inquiries within proper bounds or following adequate procedures, but as the court saw it, to push back against an effort by the legislature and the executive to reduce the investigators' independence. So the court stood between the agency and the executive and legislature. Coordination would involve a more complex set of negotiations. I'm not entirely sure what those would be. I don't know of I don't know. When I say I don't know, I mean I just don't know. There may be examples, but I don't know of them, of examples of effective coordination by the courts of these fairly complicated questions. So to close, I said at the outset this was the beginning of a larger inquiry. As I have presented this paper, this is now the third time I've done it in Brazil, I've come to understand that each part of it is actually quite complicated, more complicated than my prior understanding was, and more complicated than some of the observations I've already made. And for that reason, I look forward to your reactions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Tushnet. And now we'd like to have some questions.
Dear Professor Tushnet, thank you for your splendid talk. As Professor Dworkin said in his last book, the principle of dignity is essential for life, for democracy. Our issue in Brazil is beyond institutional perspective or constitutional designs. Our main problem and corruption enforcement is moral. My question is how to create a design or a moral of model of institutional capacities with a lack of moral principles. Is this possible in order to save Brazilian democracy?
That is, of course, an extremely important and maybe a more important question than anything that I've talked about. Creating a culture of honesty rather than a culture of corruption is probably the most effective way to control corruption. Having a well-designed anti-corruption agency may work to deal with corruption once it occurs if the institution is well-designed, but if you have a great deal of corruption, even a well-designed agency isn't going to do very much. So the institutional design question that you raise is design of institutions to generate an anti-corruption culture. You called it a moral culture. There are some ways to do it within the boundaries of the kinds of things lawyers think about. The primary example I like to use is of Singapore. Singapore and secondarily Hong Kong, both of which had in the 1950s for Singapore and in the 1970s for Hong Kong quite corrupt governments. What they did is basically set salaries for public officials very high and then impose extremely strong sanctions for corruption. So in Singapore, I love these two examples. First, in Singapore, the salary of a minister is set at the average of the salary of the 5 most highly paid private sector people doing a similar job. Okay, so they are paid extremely well. Okay? And if you engage in corruption, you lose that salary. It's very serious. I mean, you might be able to get some other job, but it's not going to pay nearly as well as what you're getting as a minister. And then, this is the second example, treat as corrupt very minor deviations from proper behavior. So, one example, I can't get the details right by memory, but is a minister who, during an authorized trip, took a private cooking course. And that was regarded as diverting public resources and lost his job as a result of taking like a 3-day course in how to cook, French food. So, if you do it really seriously, if you impose serious sanctions on well-paying jobs, you can accomplish something. But the Singaporean strategy is very expensive, and can't be done everywhere or even probably widely. So then the question is, well, what other institutions could promote this kind of culture of morality? And I will just say that it may be a limitation of my imagination as a law-trained person that I sort of say, I don't really know what we as lawyers could do to design such institutions. It has something to do with public education. It has something to do with the vigor of civil society, but I'm not sure of what design could promote this culture of public morality.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your speech, Professor Tushnet. I would like to ask you two questions. One is a more informative question about what's the composition of the South American agency, anti-corruption agency. And the second one is I would like you to develop more about you said that democratic legitimacy presupposes confidence in the authorities. What do you mean by confidence? And I would like to know more precisely if you could conceptualize what confidence is. And a third question is, I think it's a bit there is a kind of a contradiction between when you say democratic legitimacy presupposes confidence in the authorities, that face the problem of independency. So how can you combine confidence and independency in such a status that has more or less independency in their political governments, for example?
Right.
Thank you.
So, as to the first question about who the South African investigators are, both the head of the Scorpions and the head of the Hawks were ordinary police officials who had advanced pretty far in their careers. So they were, I don't know exactly what their prior positions were, but they were, like chief of a division of some investigating division within a police agency. They were, in some sense, ordinary police officers, but who had advanced within the police services almost certainly by demonstrating good performance beforehand. On the democratic legitimacy question, I would say, why is confidence necessary? I think it is that it's necessary so that when a person sees a public official doing something that the person disagrees with, the citizen will say, I disagree with that, but I understand that the official is doing the best he or she can to advance the public good as the official understands it. Now, their understanding is different from mine. That's why we disagree. But we're both, the confidence means, we both are focused on doing the public good. And I start out by saying it's important when there's disagreement between the citizen and the public officials. Just one dimension of democracy is if that disagreement becomes large enough, then the citizens will replace the public officials with others who advance what the citizens believe to be the proper vision of the public good. The second part of your question, if I understood it right, is, well, what about the citizen who agrees with what the public official is doing but wants more of it done? The public official then becomes, in your terms, I think, dependent upon the public in a way that might undermine democracy, or undermine the public officials' pursuit of what the official regards as the real public interest or the real public good. I think I should note, I think that concern is what motivates a great deal of the recent writing about the rise of populism in democratic systems. I have only just begun to think seriously about that problem, if it is one, and that phrase indicates where my initial thinking is. I'm not clear. It's not clear to me that public officials going along with a self-generated view among the public, or a view among the public generated by a populist political party, I'm not sure that that's non-democratic. It may be bad, and maybe I don't like what they're doing, but I'm not sure it's anti-democratic. But my thinking on this is very, very preliminary. There's a conference in July among constitutional scholars in which I'm participating on a panel on the rise of populism, and I hope to have a more well-formed view at that point.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Tushnet, for your presentation. I would like to ask you about the exercise of the anti-corruption agencies and how the judiciary can oversee the activities in order to respect the democratic values and the due process of law. In Brazil, we have this debate nowadays because the Lava Jato operation, and I'd like to ask you this question.
I don't know the details of the Brazilian situation in sufficient depth to comment specifically about it. I note that the decision that was apparently made on Tuesday to release somebody from pretrial detention is in the form of procedural review. It is a denial of, as I understand it, the claim is, the finding was that it was a denial of due process to hold somebody in pretrial detention for an excessively long period. So the form of that is what I called procedural review. Okay? Now, review of procedure for compliance with due process. On the one hand, that is the kind of thing that we would expect judges trained in law to be able to do. On the other, I do want to note that there may be special characteristics of anti-corruption agencies that require the adjustment of what otherwise would be regarded as due process procedures in order to make the investigations effective. And judges might not be sensitive to those special characteristics. So without expressing a view on the pretrial release decision. It might be the case that prosecutors need need to restrict the liberty of suspects, which is what they are at this point, in order to induce them to reveal information that they would not reveal in other investigative ways. I don't know whether that's true. I wonder whether, I should say, a prosecutor will almost always, I think, claim that it is true. I don't know whether a judge, a legally trained judge, would be able to assess that claim. And so, I can see the case for release, and I can see that there might be a case for continued detention, but I don't know how to assess the latter, and therefore I don't know what the right kind of answer is. I think that's going to be a general problem with judicial review by judges for procedural regularity on the part of anti-corruption investigators.
Good morning, Professor Tushnet. I have two questions about the Supreme Court decision in 2010 on Citizens United, and I would like to ask if the anti-corruption and the electoral agencies have their work undermined by this decision. And the second question is, what's your personal view on the matter?
So on the second, my view is that, let me summarize. The Supreme Court in that and subsequent cases, the U.S. Supreme Court, in that and subsequent cases said that the only permissible reason for restricting campaign contributions is to avoid corruption in the sense of private enrichment by the recipient of the donation. My view is that that is too narrow a view of corruption in connection with campaign contributions. Okay, I think it may be a fine definition with respect to other things like donations to the personal account of the recipient. So just, okay, I have an example, but I take too long to give it. On the more general point about how electoral fairness should be assessed, here I would say that in the paper I have a brief discussion of electoral fairness and election commissions. And I do think that electoral fairness is a concept that requires a higher degree of sensitivity to how politics actually operates than is likely to be held by any constitutional court and certainly by the U.S. Supreme Court. So I think that the decision in Citizens United and other related cases, those decisions are wrong partly for reasons of institutional design. That is, to make those decisions well, you have to have people who are both lawyers and quite sensitive to the way politics really operates. And that's how you would, and that's why electoral commissions should be designed differently from constitutional courts, unless you have resource limits of the sort that I mentioned early on. But basically, in the U.S., we don't have an electoral commission, so it's only the Supreme Court that can do it, and they don't have the political sensitivity that's required to do the job well.
Morning, Professor. Thank you very much for your lecture. During your exposition, you talked about independence as an essential element for institutions on investigating corruption. But I see independence by two bias. The first one, the autonomy of the institution, and the second one, the independence of the agents of the institution. The second one may not be too convenient once the agents can use their power to pursue their political enemies. So our challenge and my question is how to create autonomous institutions with not so independent agents. Thank you.
I want to divide my answer into two parts. The first deals with the low-level investigators, the people who are actually going out and executing the search warrants and conducting the interrogations and so on. In the U.S., we've experienced excessive independence by those agents in anti-corruption inquiries. The remedy for that is ordinary bureaucratic control. That is, the higher up of the agency should and has the means to keep the lower level investigators in line. Doing that is often a difficult task of bureaucratic leadership, but it's an ordinary task of bureaucratic leadership. The other part of the problem is the one I alluded to of excessive independence by the head of the agency. I have a couple of thoughts. One I mentioned, which is to have a multi-headed agency that can't act unless everybody agrees. The other is to disqualify the investigator from future advancement of some sort. I'd have to think about how to do it exactly. You don't want to say, well, when you conduct this investigation, it's the end of your career as a prosecutor. You might want to say something like, if you conduct it too aggressively, it's the end of your career. Maybe it's disqualification from other offices or from bureaucratic advancement. Yes, you can remain a prosecutor, but you're not going to do anything as significant as this in the future. I don't know, but some restriction on post-action, post-investigation action might be one way to go.
Thank you.
Thank you very much on your lecture, Professor. My personal research is about the necessary balance between secrecy and transparency for us to have democracy. In this case, I would like to know if in this South African case you studied, if there is any public information law, any law assuring citizens the access to information about institutions, and if it is so, if it is being truly enforceable.
So I haven't examined South African law on this issue in detail. I do know, first, there is an expansive Freedom of Information Act available in South Africa. And as I mentioned, there's an ombudsperson whose job is to respond to citizen complaints about bureaucratic decisions. My sense is that there's a significant degree of transparency. In the context of corruption investigations, I think there are reasons to be concerned about too much transparency. That's why I suggested earlier a procedural rule about keeping the investigation secret for as long as you can. But that's really all that I can say. They do have extensive freedom of information laws.
Thank you.
Good morning, Professor. The Lava Jato operation, which has been going on in Brazil for about 2 years, has received some criticism as to whether or not it is impartial. And that often leads to one of two solutions: either dismantling it altogether, or that the people should mobilize themselves to pressure the authorities to persecute and investigate everyone equally. And so my question is, in the second case, what role should the public opinion, considering that it can be biased and partial itself, should have in something this big? Thank you.
First, I think it is an essential to an effective anti-corruption process that it both be and be perceived as even-handed, not being used for partisan advantage. The problem with the Scorpions may not have been that they were not investigating President Mbeki. Maybe there wasn't very much corruption there, but they were seen as not investigating. And that is a significant problem. When you focus on perceptions, then you do have this concern that what if the perception is wrong? Lots of people are saying it's a biased investigation, but it isn't. I think that's the real. So, if it is a biased investigation, then I don't think there's anything wrong with public pressure, saying, "Look, Zuma's corrupt. We know that, but so is Mbeki, and you should go after him as well." A footnote here: there is a problem when Mbeki's corrupt, but Zuma is, by a scale of magnitude, much more corrupt than Mbeki, which is true. Zuma is a deeply corrupt figure, but Mbeki was, I think, only modestly corrupt. So that is, what does even-handed mean under those circumstances? But being even-handed is right. So what can you do about mistaken public perceptions? At some level, maybe the answer is suggested by the prior question, which is a high level of transparency by the investigator, which probably means something like reports saying, you say that we are investigating only Zuma's allies. Actually, we've investigated Mbeki's allies in the following cases, and we concluded, and here's why we concluded, that they had not engaged in wrongful behavior. Okay? Now, one problem with that is the public might not believe your conclusion. So in the US, we have this experience. I would say we have a president now as the result of a disclosure by an anti-corruption agent, the FBI, that they had investigated Hillary Clinton and closed the investigation. The mere statement about having had the investigation, damaged her politically. So I think this is the false perception problem. False perception of a lack of even-handedness is a real problem. And I confess at the moment I don't have any idea how to handle it.
Thank you.
Good morning, Professor. You said in your lecture that prosecution agents should have their power limited somehow. I would like to know how to limit the power of these prosecution agencies without increasing bureaucracy. Thank you.
Without implicating?
Increasing bureaucracy. Thank you.
So I think the honest answer is you can't. That is, any mechanisms for controlling agents' behavior will make the process more bureaucratic and cumbersome. And that is a problem. You want some supervision, but not too much. And you want supervision by somebody who understands the problems rather than somebody who doesn't. That's why I am sort of skeptical about review by courts of these agencies. I think I said early on, I don't have answers to these. These are very difficult design questions.
Oh, that's it.
Professor Tushnet, it's a big pleasure to attend your lecture once again. I have one question related to desired characteristics of IPDs, institution protecting democracy. Apparently, independence and accountability are desired characteristics of such institutions, and these two characteristics resemble Adrian Vermeer's mechanisms of democracy, impartiality, and accountability itself. Nevertheless, Vermeer states that some trade-offs of those values or characteristics are necessary to achieve a better democracy. According to him, impartiality trades off against motivation, transparency trades off against deliberation and against accountability. So my question is how to deal with such trade-offs when it comes to designing IPDs, and is it possible to define in advance which characteristics should be preferred? Thank you.
I think there's a general abstract answer that applies in an unfortunately limited domain, which is, and this is, I think, Vermeule's answer, in a reasonably well-functioning democracy, we let the democratic process determine what the trade-offs are. Whatever comes out of the democratic process is the trade-off that is acceptable, desirable, whatever term you want to use. That I think is his answer. The difficulty is that it has a limited domain of well-functioning democracies. And if you have a badly functioning democracy, first of all, you have to have some definition of what the difference is between well-functioning and badly functioning. That's not easy. But if you have something that you describe as a badly functioning democracy, then almost by definition, you can't say, well, the outcome of the democratic process is the acceptable trade-off or balance between these two things. My instinct is to say, first of all, my instinct is to say many of the places that we're most interested in, South Africa, Brazil, are in varying ways not well-functioning democracies. So I know about South Africa, you have a dominant party, the African National Congress. That causes democratic difficulty. I will assert, without defending it and subject to being refuted, that in Brazil you have a different kind of malfunction, which is an overly weak party system. Now, it might be that, it almost certainly is, that The answer, how do you figure out what the trade-off is? The answer to the question of how you figure out the trade-off would differ depending on the nature of the bad functioning of the system. So in South Africa, it might be that for local contingent reasons, having a fairly aggressive constitutional court would work. It might be that the same solution would not work in Brazil. I do note that there is a body of literature associated with David Landau about Colombia and Samuel Zakharov about a whole bunch of places, saying that actually aggressive constitutional courts can be pretty good where you have weak party systems. The answer, I think the only answer to give is you have to look at the nature of the democratic bad functioning before you can figure out how you address, how you determine what the appropriate trade-off is. Okay, so the answer comes in two stages. Well-functioning democratic system, accept the trade-off made by the system as it operates. Badly functioning system, first look at what the nature of the malfunction is, and then second, figure out, given that malfunction, that particular malfunction, what other institutions might adjust the balance. It's very abstract, but I think the second part has to be abstract.
Good morning, Professor Tushnet. First, I would like to thank you for your lecture. It was great to have the opportunity to listen to such a great class. My question is, isn't a problem to fill in the anti-corruption agencies with a political group? For example, following the design of a 3-person director office you've mentioned. Because even considering that this group is not homogeneous or that there is an internal political diversity, isn't an alternative that keeps all the problems faced by the legislative power you've mentioned in your lecture?
That's an extremely good question. In the part of the paper where I talk about election commissions, I note that there are a couple of models for composing them. One is the bipartisan model. Have the parties select a number of members and hope that they will balance each other. That requires that you have, it's easiest to work out with a 2-party system, but maybe with a small number of parties you could do you could do something similar. If you have a different kind of party system, you're not going to be able to do it that way. And the other model is to have, this is, I think I'm describing the Venezuelan election commission, I'm not absolutely sure, but the model is to say, you have a nominating body that consists of civil society people. The Venezuelan says representatives of law faculties and political science departments, and some politicians. There's a majority in the first three groups. They come up with a list of candidates, and then the president or the legislature has to pick from that list. And it could be a list of 6 from which you pick 3. That's a way of addressing the concern that you... so system designers appreciate the concern that you've articulated. And this civil society model actually seems, they've settled on it in some places. It seems like a sensible solution.
Thank you.
Obrigada a todos pelas perguntas. Pelo avançar da hora, nós encerraremos por aqui. Quero agradecer mais uma vez ao professor Mark Tushnet e a todos os presentes pela palestra. Thank you, Professor, once again.